There's been immense buzz about Alex Garland's latest and supposedly final film, all of which seems to be intentional. I remember when it was announced, and everyone was freaking out thinking it was going to be some sort of scathing commentary about the volatility of the current American politics. But since about early to mid-March, I've heard nothing but mixed to negative reviews about the film. The initial critical reviews panned the film for being far too politically surface level, having nothing of note to add to the discourse. Are those reviews accurate? What do you have to say about it, you all ask me? Well, I'll tell you, but I should preface this discussion by saying I care deeply about politics. As an American, I'm heavily invested in the leaders we elect, the policies they write and attempt to enact. I feel that as an American and a person of color, politics is just far too important for me to ignore. All of that being said, I do believe that art can just be art. So much art is political, and that's because it's toiled over by its creator. Art is used to comment on the world the artist lives in, usually. It's a form of self-expression, and people expressing themselves often do so on a matter personally affecting them. When I see reviews for a particular piece of art, and those reviews are from people saying it wasn't quote-unquote politically incisive enough, or it had nothing of value to say, I roll my eyes. If you're looking for political art, plenty exists, and if you're complaining, you definitely know where to find it. There are plenty of political films that will be of interest to you, but I want to differentiate myself from those reviews here. I want to make this review about the film, not just its politics or lack thereof. Hey, my name is Sanjay, and today I want to get to the bottom of Civil War to find out what this film is saying, and not what we hoped it would. Civil War is the fourth feature-length film of writer-director Alex Garland, and as stated previously, supposedly his last film. I would say that Garland has a pretty strong film catalog. I say that referencing the 4 films he's written and directed specifically, not just films he's written or produced. Garland's previous film, Men, which came out 2 years ago now, received mixed reviews among critics and fans alike. I saw the film in theaters and came away with a very mixed reaction myself. But I would argue Garland is a sci-fi powerhouse, with arguably his 2 most popular films being Annihilation and Ex Machina, my personal favorite. In many ways, Civil War feels almost like a departure for Garland, seeing as it's steeped in much more quote-unquote realism than something like Ex Machina, for example. Civil War has a much more grounded approach, where there's no futuristic technology, no alien threat, just good old-fashioned American warfare. Civil War follows 4 journalists: Lee, played by Kirsten Dunst, Joe, played by Wagner Moura, Sammy, played by Stephen McKinley Henderson, and Jesse, played by Kaylee Spaney. These journalists are on a journey to Washington, D.C. to interview the president before he is deposed by the rapidly encroaching enemy combatants, the Western Forces, an alliance of California and Texas, whose union is only further proof of the film's disinterest with partisan politics, as these 2 diametrically opposed states have put aside their differences to join forces. The specifics of this civil war confused me going into the film and during. There's little explanation as to who exactly is fighting who and why. It's all left very vague so as to allow us to wonder why it is the president is serving a 3rd term, possibly in an attempt to reunify the fractured United States we hear throughout his many broadcasts during the film. Why is it that California and Texas are suddenly aligned? It leaves room for projection, I suppose, and I'm not sure how to feel about it. For that reason alone, I feel the film warrants a second viewing, which I plan to do sometime soon. For starters, visually the film is gorgeous. The cinematography, the photography, it's all mesmerizing. It's bright and colorful, not bleak at all in terms of visuals, which is interesting considering the subject matter. But I would argue that this is Garland at his best, stylistically at least. I think the editing is great as well, very snappy. There are moments throughout the film where our journalists are snapping photos of the conflict, and there will be a moment where the photo flashes on the screen. It's quick, it's unique, and I think it really immerses viewers in its world. The soundtrack is also pretty great. Music is also important to me, and typically music makes films, and more specifically scenes, very memorable to me. If a scene has a good song, you can bet I'll remember it. It can also be a cheap way to elicit emotions from the audience, which I find all too frequently in films of lesser quality. But this film doesn't do that, and I respect that. There's a lot of sonic dissonance, which is when a song that doesn't match the scene it's in plays. Something awful happens and an upbeat song plays, something like that. I very much enjoy that technique, and this film employs it in several scenes. much to the film's advantage. I also felt that the original score was fantastic, very somber and reflective. The film really moves. It's an hour and 50 minutes long, and I felt that not a second was wasted. It really keeps you on your toes, not knowing what you'll see next. The pacing was great. I didn't feel like any scenes were overly long or unnecessary. By the end, I knew it was almost over and couldn't believe how quickly it had happened. This isn't a criticism either. It's a compliment. With the subject matter being so foreboding, I'm glad there was very little dawdling. Everything we saw served a purpose. As far as the story goes, I thought it was fine. It's by no means complex, but it was interesting at the very least. This is truly a divided America at war with itself. We see how the different factions treat one another, how they treat civilians and journalists, and that feels unique. I did have some critiques with the writing, however. I don't think this is Garland's best script. Some of the dialogue feels far too exposition-y. Characters talk as if they're explaining things to the audience and not to each other. It's a bit distracting, and none of the dialogue really stands out as memorable. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Kirsten Dunst isn't the greatest actress. I'll admit, I've only seen her in Spider-Man as MJ, which wasn't her greatest performance either, I'd say. But she definitely struggles with acting and line delivery in this film. That being said, I liked her character. Lee is a beat-down, exhausted journalist. She knows she has got to get the best shot, but it's very obvious that her work is killing her on the inside. This isn't something she loves doing anymore, and I like that it's implied that it didn't always used to be this way. Kaylee Spaney's Jessie is a great foil to Lee. Jessie is young, wide-eyed, still wet behind the ears. She's eager to get started, but she lacks confidence. We learn early on that Lee is one of Jessie's heroes, but Lee isn't interested in any of that, at least not anymore. She's sort of indifferent toward Jessie, doesn't want to mentor her or look after her. Switching gears a bit, Wagner Moore as Joe is awesome. He and Spaney are two highlights for me. I thought their performances were standouts. Joe is a very fun character. Unlike any of the other journalists, he's wild. This is something he's been doing for a while and still loves. He loves the rush of being on the front lines of battle. He isn't really a photographer like Jessie or Lee. I'd argue he's more of an interviewer, maybe? We don't see him do much journalistically. He sort of just acts like a wild card, and that's great. One of the most subdued performances in the film is Stephen McKinley Henderson's Sammy. I wouldn't say that he's underutilized necessarily, but he plays a much smaller role than the other three. He's the wise mentor. You can tell he guided Lee through her formative years, and now he wants her to do the same for Jessie. His character isn't anything to write home about, but he's fine. Seeing as our four protagonists are journalists, it goes without saying that journalists and journalism have thematic resonance within this film. In the film, journalists are portrayed as vulture-like, swooping in after a particularly violent outburst to pick clean the bones of the fallen, though in their case, they just want to take pictures of it. In the film's version of America, it's evident that journalism has become an extreme sport, a competition to see who can capture the most gruesome shot. Their portrayal certainly is caricature-esque. One of the first scenes of the film is that of a crowd of rabid journalists crowding around a group of civilians ostensibly begging for more water rations. Quickly, violence breaks out. Police begin brutalizing civilians, and the journalists swoop in and begin photographing everything, each hoping to get a good shot. They remind me of a Ray Bradbury short story called The Crowd, wherein a voyeuristic crowd of people gathers at the scene of any tragedy. You certainly don't get the sense that the journalists are the good guys in this film. I'd argue there really aren't any good guys, just bad guys and worse ones. On some level, we're supposed to be rooting for our protagonists. We follow them for the entire film. We see much of the film from Lee's perspective, but none of them seem like particularly good people. Well, none except for Jessie, and that changes by the end of the film. And anyways, Jessie's only good insofar that she's unexperienced and childlike. She appears to be very young. Lee thinks she's just a child, but it's revealed that she's actually 23 years old. In a film that's as apolitical as this one, its portrayal of journalists feels quite the opposite. I can't help but feel that in a world where many Americans, hell, most people across the globe, have lost faith in the media is somehow reflective of what this film is trying to say by showing us these cold journalists. These aren't people who care about raising awareness. They only seek profit for their work. They're greedy, self-obsessed, and negligent. They're like fucked up TikTokers, only concerned with turning the darkest parts of their lives into content for monetary gain. But I don't like this film's portrayal of journalism. You can say I'm reading too far into all this, that I'm projecting, but Garland isn't an idiot. While the film takes a hands-off political stance, it is somewhat influenced by reality, with Garland stating in an interview that he began work on the film in 2018 only to put it down and come back to it 2 years later in the midst of the pandemic, arguably the catalyst for the ongoing radicalization and division in American politics. There's certainly a group of viewers who will come away from this film feeling vindicated that their belief that all journalists are money-hungry monsters intent on only dividing us further was confirmed. Even if it wasn't Garland's intention to do so, it could come across as such. I think more than anything, Garland didn't want to contribute to the political climate of the United States by having his film exist strictly on either side of the American political aisles. One might argue then, why set this film, which is starkly relevant, in the US at all if it isn't interested in being a political story? To that I say, marketing. Many of the early reviews from critics panning the film for being apolitical were upset that Garland chose to set the film in the US and release it during an election year, all decisions that feel far too precise to be written off entirely. It's horrifying to say that we're at a point in history where something like this could realistically happen. I doubt it would be on such a large scale, seeing as in Civil War, the Western Alliance and similar rebellious forces have amassed sizable arsenals of military equipment and weaponry, from tanks to helicopters and missiles. So perhaps the film is saying something about gun culture in America. I don't know. Sure, most characters we see throughout the film are armed to the teeth, save for the journalists, whose cameras are almost gun-like in nature given how they are wielded. As with the entirety of the film, however, there is no stance taken either way. The guns are there because they need to be. When we're shown a small town that has somehow avoided the conflict toward the middle of the film, we're shown two, who I assumed were gunmen, on top of a roof, keeping the peace, I suppose. Two good guys with guns, quote-unquote, but there's never any commentary about how more weapons doesn't equate to safety. There's never any questions being asked of the audience to contend with, no questions for the main characters either. The violence is a given, there's no need to fuss over the cause. But creating scenarios this way feels somehow wrong, like there needs to be some sort of broader discussion about how gun culture can be dangerous, but the film isn't interested in that discussion. I feel I've made it pretty clear that I do believe art can be apolitical. It frustrates me a bit that we're at a point in time now where if art doesn't have anything political to say, it is forgotten or ridiculed publicly. Of course, this is mostly conjecture. I haven't bought any proof to support my claims, but this film should be emblematic enough of my point. So why then is it wrong for Garland to have made Civil War apolitical? I don't know that it is wrong. Why do we feel the need to assign morality to something like this? Why is it either right or wrong? Why do we even care? Why does it matter? Because art has implications and effects. Art is powerful. Art can be weaponry all its own. Being apolitical is political in a funny, twisted way. By proclaiming you're apolitical, you're saying loudly that you're privileged enough not to care what happens to everyone else. You'll be fine no matter who gets elected, no matter what laws they enact. I'd argue that, in and of itself, is somewhat violent. During a panel at South by Southwest, Garland had this to say when asked what the film was about, if not politics. Garland explained that it's about political divisiveness in general, and our insistence on talking and not listening. He said there are politicians and people in the media on both sides of the divide who are wonderful, and that left and right are ideological arguments about how to run a state, and nothing more. He says what we should be doing is trying one, voting it out if it doesn't work, and then trying the other one. But we've made it into good and bad, he said, which made politics a moral issue. And he said that's fucking idiotic and incredibly dangerous. I also firmly believe he is entitled to his own opinion. I am a proponent of the First Amendment, believe it or not. But I also think that what he's saying is fucking absurd. Sure, left and right ideological arguments come down to how we will run these states, but that's very surface-level understanding of American politics in general. Remember when Trump said there were quote-unquote good people on both sides during the riots in Charlottesville? Funnily enough, a main location in the film, riots where white supremacists marched in the streets, chanting anti-Semitic phrases, with protesters clashing against them. In the same way, Garland is saying that both sides are playing by the same rules and are equally morally justified in their pursuits, which I think is far from the truth. I don't think there's anything morally right about a side that actively advocates for extremism, a side that owns much of the political violence in the United States. While these numbers have gone down a bit, there's no denying the reality that one side is far more comfortable pushing rhetoric that leads to violence than the other. When fear is used as a motivator, one can only expect such an escalation. This isn't something that exists in a vacuum. Political disagreements have real-world consequences. Is Garland so over partisan politics that he's willing to engage with a side that actively advocates that immigrants are poisoning the blood of America? Are those espousing such rhetoric truly on the same level as those denouncing it? To me, the answer is clear, but I'll leave you all to draw your own conclusions. I certainly don't think that we should quote-unquote try both sides either. If one works, it's good. If the other doesn't, so be it. There's too much at stake for that to even be a consideration. I don't want to give fascism a try. I don't want to give dictatorship a try. These are points I shouldn't even have to make, but here we are. It's almost astonishing how political this apolitical film has been. If Garland's intention was to draw attention to this film, I'd say mission accomplished. I think it's safe to say that regardless of what you think going into this film, you'll likely leave the theater feeling defeated. This isn't a feel-good film. This isn't a film that will bring you joy outside of the obvious talent and passion for the craft that went into it. So, what is Civil War? What does it have to say? Can I even answer those questions? I think Civil War is a film meant to shock and disturb. It's meant to show us the worst sides of humanity, what we can all become when we only see red, when everything is us versus them. I do think partisan politics are dangerous and divisive. I don't like the way in which America is heading in terms of political ideology and violence. We're all too angry at each other, far too blinded by that anger to see that there are people on the other side, actual people. We're all just scared, and when we're scared, we lash out. By saying all this, I'm not attempting to downplay the dangerous rhetoric that both sides can express. I'm just saying that we all need to remember that at the end of the day, we're all human. Despite my criticisms, despite the critics who bashed it initially, I would recommend this film. It isn't supposed to satisfy you with its conclusion. It's meant to make you think, and for that alone, it's worth seeing. Go and see this film, come up with your own theories, your own opinions. I don't want my political critiques to influence my rating on this film. After all, it is a film first and foremost, as I've said. For that reason, I'd give Civil War an 8 out of 10. What do you think? Have you seen this film? Did this review make you want to? If so, let me know in the comments. Don't subscribe unless you want to, but know that I appreciate it. If you feel so inclined, leave a like. As always, thanks for watching.